So our topic for this chapter was basically the Enlightenment and the political revolutions that took place in Europe and the Americas. And yesterday we focused on the scientific revolution. And in this video, we're going to pick up with Civil War and Revolution in England. So our dates for that are 1642 to 1651. And what led to Civil War? Well, England was in continual revolts against their kings, and usually it was over religion. You had Catholics, Protestants, Presbyterians, Quakers, and Anglicans. And all of this came to a climax when King James I and his son, King Charles I, ran out of money. And the problem is when the king runs out of money, he has to go to Parliament in order to get more money. And so the struggle between the king and the Parliament fighting over money brought about this civil war. And so Parliament refused to give the king money. And on top of that, they questioned his right to power. They wanted religious tolerance, and they wanted to give out government positions on the basis of merit or ability, not just birthright. And Charles I rejected this. And on top of that, he tried to levy really heavy taxes without Parliament's approval. And so ultimately, Parliament executed Charles I, and his son, Charles II, eventually fled the country because he feared for his life, and rightly so. So who stepped into this power vacuum? Oliver Cromwell, and this, you may have heard his name before, but Oliver Cromwell emerged as the parliamentary leader, named himself Lord Protector of England. And this was from 1653 to 58. And spoiler alert, this guy was just as bad as Charles. He was sort of like a military dictator, and he defeated those who rebelled against his government in Ireland and Scotland and joined them with England to form the British Commonwealth. So all of this fighting is going on, and Parliament nor Cromwell were able to come up with an effective government. So in 1660, eventually the monarchy was restored, and they brought back Charles I's son, Charles II, to the throne. And Cromwell's body was later dug up, beheaded, and his head was left on a pole for several years outside of Westminster Abbey. Nevertheless, the Civil War did establish the principle that the monarchy could be abolished. We saw that yesterday when we talked about Locke and Hobbes and the limits on power, the idea of a social contract, that the purpose of a king is to protect the people. And so this Civil War proved that the monarchy was not necessarily an absolute ruler, unaccountable to anyone. Okay, so the Glorious Revolution, this was 1688, and this one was nonviolent. So Charles II, who was restored to the throne in 1660, and then his brother, James II, continued to claim more power than Parliament wanted to give. And James especially was deemed sympathetic toward Catholicism. And so people feared that James II's son would turn the country back to Catholicism. And so they invited James's daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange, they were the Protestant rulers of the Netherlands, to rule England as well. And so they arrived in 1688, and this marked the Glorious Revolution. Is sometimes called the Bloodless Revolution because this was done peacefully. And they confirmed this by defeating the troops that were still loyal to James II at the Battle of Boyne in Ireland in 1690. And so this would eventually lead to an English Bill of Rights in 1689, just a year after the Glorious Revolution. And three basic things here. One is that no taxes could be collected, nor armies raised without Parliament's consent. Now, keep in mind, Parliament is sort of like our Congress. This is a representative body of government. And so the first one was, again, no taxes collected and no armies raised without Parliament's consent. and they, again, are representing the people. Also, due process of law, the idea that you aren't just thrown in jail, that you are given a trial, a fair trial. And then, of course, out of this came the Toleration Act of 1689, which granted dissenters, or those not a part of the Anglican Church, the right to worship freely in public. And this was true for, well, all Protestant groups, but not Roman Catholics. So we're switching gears a little bit to talk about the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was centered in France. Even though many of the key participants lived elsewhere, the movement itself was centered in France. And this was an age when philosophers argued that human progress was possible if people would take the time to expand their knowledge, thereby becoming enlightened. This stood in stark contrast to the teachings of the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church argued that we were born into sin. This doctrine is called original sin, and we were condemned from the start, so there's really no hope for human progress. But Enlightenment philosophers argued that humans could become better and could progress. They believed that rational thinking would ultimately lead to finding order in the universe. And for the most part, the Enlightenment philosophers met in salons in the larger cities to discuss their ideas. Most of them did not completely reject religion or God altogether. Most were actually deists, or they practiced deism. And this is the belief that there was a creator, there was a God who created everything, but he just set the world in motion and then just kind of backed off and was watching things play out. And this is sort of the basis for deism. A lot of the founding fathers were actually deists as well. So looking at some of these people, the first one is Baron de Montesquieu, and he wrote the Persian Letters. And this is a satire which criticizes the French institutions, mainly the monarchy and the church. Montesquieu did not disagree with, did not like the king, the French king, or the church. He thought they were power hungry and corrupt. And his most influential work, called The Spirit of the Laws, advocated that different countries needed different kinds of government. So Montesquieu wasn't coming out against all kings or a certain kind of government. He said different countries have different needs for government, but at any rate, they shouldn't be power hungry. The second Enlightenment thinker is Diderot, and his accomplishment was called Encyclopedia, and it is what it sounds like. It was 17 volumes of text, 11 of illustrations, and he worked much of his life compiling information to put in this encyclopedia. When it was published, he found that some of his editors had taken out portions of the text because they feared he would get in trouble for things that he had said against the French government. The next one is Francois-Marie Arouet, who took the pen name Voltaire to try to protect him from getting in trouble for the things he said, because like many other Enlightenment thinkers, he criticized the clergy, organized religion altogether. He criticized those who were superstitious, and he argued for freedom of religion, which wasn't really that popular in France. Also, freedom of inquiry, just the ability to ask questions and not be penalized for it. And the freedom of the press, the ability of newspapers and magazines to print whatever they want without fear of censorship or punishment. But Voltaire believed that human fate was ultimately decided by humans. In terms of political thought, the philosophers in general weren't really committed to democracy. Voltaire advocated for a benevolent, enlightened despot like Frederick II of Prussia, Catherine II of Russia, or Joseph II of Austria. They were all kings or queens, but they were enlightened, they were kind, and they ruled with their people in mind. In all three of those countries, the taxes were reasonable, agricultural and handicraft production were encouraged, there was freedom of religion, and they had strong militaries. So that's actually called enlightened despotism. The next one is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and he was actually skeptical of democracy because he questioned the average person's intellect and the ability of the people to make good decisions, though he wasn't completely against it. He believed in the general will of the people. That was his key thought there, the general will. Basically, majority rule. And this is a direct quote from Rousseau. He said, "Whoever refuses to obey the general will shall be compelled to do so by the whole body." In other words, if you don't go with the general will, you will be forced to do so. And then lastly, we have Adam Smith. And Adam Smith is our free market economist who put forth the idea of capitalism, or laissez-faire economics. In other words, the government sort of backs off and lets the invisible hand of competition regulate the economy. He also argued that it was human nature for people to want to better their condition. So naturally there would be upward mobility. People would want to work hard so that they could improve their situation in life. So that brings us to the revolution in North America, sometimes called the Revolutionary War or the War for Independence. And this is probably the fastest that we will ever cover this topic. But our years here are 1775 to 1881. And so to start things off, by the 1760s, Americans were sick of British control. They were sick of the British controlling them politically and economically. The British had control over trade. They were restricting American shipping. They were limiting what goods could be produced or manufactured, and they began to tax the Americans, which that wasn't totally unfair, as they were taxing them to pay for the French and Indian War, which worked for the good of Americans. So the Americans revolted in 1776 and declared themselves an independent country. And this was after riots and boycotts and even some destruction of government property. But the Americans established a political democracy. They abolished the concept of a monarch, having a monarch or king, and they replaced it with an elected government. Americans declared that all men were created equal and born with certain rights, namely life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. For the most part, leaders of the revolution were entrepreneurs or business owners. They were soldiers. They were statesmen. Not really many nobles. Many of the nobles and the wealthy landed classes remained loyal to England. That's why they were called loyalists. But the Americans finally achieved peace with Great Britain in 1883. And the leaders of the 13 colonies met in Philadelphia. They drafted a new constitution in 1789 and then a Bill of Rights in 1791. Many of the colonies would not approve of the United States Constitution until it had a Bill of Rights. And so that's why the first 10 amendments or changes to the Constitution are the Bill of Rights. Those, of course, include the freedom of religion, the right to bear arms, due process of law, no quartering. In other words, soldiers can't knock on your door and force you to let them stay in your home. No unreasonable searches or seizures, no cruel and unusual punishment, things like that. Historians attribute the radical American approach to the fact that many of them were religious dissenters. That is, they weren't a part of the Anglican Church or the Church of England. Also, the availability of lots of land, the absence of an aristocratic class, and probably most importantly, the Enlightenment. And you see a lot of John Locke's language and Thomas Hobbes' language in the documents that came forth out of the Revolutionary period. So this would eventually lead to the concept of manifest destiny as Americans migrated westward. And of course, Jefferson, our third president, made the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, adding to the United States a significant amount of territory. Later on down the road, Texans separating from Mexico and then joining the United States. But this concept of manifest destiny said that God had given the Americans the responsibility and the right to take over the North American continent. And so it was this God-ordained thing. The Revolution didn't really account for the other, the quote-unquote other. The Native Americans, the slaves. You see lots of language about all men being created equal, but all men, of course, did not include slaves or Indians. American Indians were slaughtered, and that was reciprocated. That was both sides, but Indians were slaughtered. Their supply of buffalo was cut down drastically by the railroad workers, and many times this was justified racially. Okay, so I know we've sort of breezed through our topic, and I didn't even really write anything here, but it's important to note that the revolution in North America was a result of Enlightenment thought. And you probably won't even see a single question on the World AP exam about the American Revolution, but it is in here, so I wanted to mention it, and we'll talk more about it in AP Euro if you take that, and of course even more about it in US history if you take that in 11th grade. So we will end our video there, and we'll pick up in the next video with the French Revolution.